within about 5 hours of crossing the border, they came across their first Russians, and it was a unit of about 11 men. And as soon as they saw them, he said that they surrendered and didn't even try to fight back. And he described them as kids, or conscripts, essentially.
It's 11 days now since Ukrainian forces launched that surprise offensive on Russian soil, which targeted the border regions, including Kursk, which you'll have heard a lot about, and other areas as well. Well, Ukraine's now set up a military administrative office in Kursk, which officials say is there to maintain law and order and meet the immediate needs of the population in the area. Tom Ball is in Ukraine for The Times, and he's been speaking to some of the soldiers who took part in that first wave of the advance. I really encourage you, find it online at thetimes.com. It made for fascinating reading. And Tom joins us now. Tom, good afternoon. Just tell us that the soldiers, you found out they were woken up, so sort of in the middle of the night, really, in dugouts in the woods, and were told, today we invade Russia. What was that like for them?
Yeah, as you say, this one of those that we spoke to, his name is Adam, and his unit had been serving in Vovchansk in the Kharkiv region in about 3 or 4 days before the operation into Kursk was launched. They were stationed in the Sumy region and were in dugouts in the woods. And in the middle of the night, their commander woke them up and says to them, right, we're off, going to go and cross the border now into Russia. And within about an hour, they had set off, and that was the start of the incursion.
And, well, we know it was a colossal failure of intelligence from Russia's perspective, but also that bit that they'd identified in Kursk was initially very easy to take. I mean, tell us what they told you, because the Russian fighters and troops they were coming up against, I mean, some of them just immediately surrendered.
Yeah, well, they clearly chose that past the border for a reason, and they identified it as being one of the weak points. And Adam said that within about 5 hours of crossing the border, they came across their first Russians, and it was a unit of about 11 men. And as soon as they saw them, he said that they surrendered and didn't even try to fight back. And he described them as kids, or conscripts, essentially. And that was largely the case the first few days that they weren't up against regular units. They're up against conscripts, guys who are in their 18 and called up for military service. And it wasn't until about 3 or 4 days in that they eventually came across Russian regular units and special forces.
And yet then, so that's 3 or 4 days in, they are still making progress. Day 11 now, still taking even more territory. What strategies, what tactics have they been using, which means they've been so successful?
Well, I mean, as you say, they've continued to expand at a rate of roughly a kilometre a day, and they now have captured, according to the Ukrainian army, about more than 1,000 square kilometres of Russian territory. I think partly it's down to the fact that Russia is, although it has reinforced the area with regular units, it's been reluctant to pull its most hardened, seasoned units from the Eastern Front, as is widely suspected to be the objective for the Ukrainians in this offensive. And so Ukraine has been able to continue carving through the Russian countryside, taking scores of towns and villages along the way, and they've done this. It's clearly been a very well coordinated operation that must have been months in the planning. And unlike the offensive that was ultimately unsuccessful that they launched last year, this it's operated on a huge secrecy. There hasn't been any talk about it beforehand, or even since the operation, really. And so they're continuing to make headway every day.
Yeah. Russia have left some traps, haven't they? Poisoned food in the areas that Ukrainian troops are taking, and also sort of delivering drone drops of food that are also poisoned.
Yeah, that was a really interesting detail that Adam said to us, was that they were coming across these packages that had been dropped by drones, which is not entirely unusual. Both armies do supply troops using this method, but in the packages were energy drinks, and they were immediately suspicious of them, and they're right to be, because, as he said, they've been poisoned with mercury. And later, as they entered Suja, which is the first town that you come to, or that they came to when crossing the border, they found that food in shops had also been poisoned with mercury as well.
Yeah, and you can understand why they've done that and why it alerted suspicion from the Ukrainian army. Tom, thank you very much. And the Times reporter in Ukraine, who's had that sort of lengthy conversation with Adam, who is one of the Ukrainian fighters who's now receiving, I think, some hospital assistance, having been hurt. But just some of the detail, realizing that you're coming across a drone package of food that's been left, that has not actually been left by Ukraine, but Russia have put it there as a sort of trap to poison the soldiers. The details are just extraordinary. Have a look inside the World section of the Times today. Listening to that conversation is the editor of the Defence Eye website, Tim Ripley, because we've had confirmation this week. The Ministry of Defence say that Kyiv have been given authorisation to use British-made weapons on Russian soil. So that means for the first time during the conflict, British-made weapons will be used in attacks on Russian buildings and people. What the MOD have said, though, is that Ukraine can't use these long-range Storm Shadow missiles. Tim, it's great to have you with us. Explain to us
Good afternoon.
why these Storm Shadow missiles are banned.
Well, these are air-launched missiles. The Ukrainians attach them to some of their own fighter planes. They have a range of 550 kilometers, which is just over 300 miles. So potentially, these are weapons that could be used to strike deep inside Russia. Which for Britain and several other NATO nations is a bit of a red line, because certainly the British and Americans and the French and the Germans are very worried that the Ukrainians would use these missiles to attack great symbolic targets. So, for example, the Kremlin. I mean, only 18 months ago, they carried out a drone attack on the Kremlin. And the implications of a British-made missile. Well, so this is the theory anyway. Landing on the Kremlin and the remnants of the British missile being dug out of what's left of the Kremlin, with the marking saying "Made in Stevenage," which is where they're made. The Russians would be prone to escalate the war, and they would fire back some of their missiles at British troops in Estonia or in Britain, and we're in World War III.
Yeah.
So that's the argument that it is an escalatory step too far for Britain and its allies in this conflict.
Have we already reached an escalatory point too far for Putin? He keeps talking about these red lines that he has and is using sort of NATO weapons on Russian soil, one of them.
Well, the Russians have, and NATO and the United States are engaged in a sort of crisis management exercise. So the Russians are only attacking so far targets that are inside the borders of Ukraine, and they are trying to persuade through their various statements that the Ukrainians should do the same thing. Now, it's if you're a Ukrainian, it's not an argument that you're going to accept, because they are obviously fighting a war of national survival, and they think every Russian target is fair game.
Of course.
They have no interest. It's against their national interest, all this stuff about escalation and containing the war, and that, because they think containing the war means consigning them to defeat. So this is a source of major tension between the UK, the United States, and the Ukrainians, who the Ukrainians obviously want every weapon they can get, every combat capability they can use, and throw it at the Russians to try and defeat them. And obviously that is something that rubs up against the interests of Britain and the United States and other NATO allies.
Yeah, and so the assessment is being made of to what extent we can support Ukraine's efforts without drawing us into something that would be even more dangerous for us. Attention always there. Tim, thank you very much. Tim Ripley, editor of the Defence Eye website.